Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Lovett. With Brett, we're going to do a double act, basically about some of the research that we've been involved in for the last 4 years or so, in particular, projects that we've been doing, projects that we're hopefully going to do, we are going to do. And it's particularly going to be looking at the issue of energy, and energy pathways, and their environmental implications, and how we try and perhaps start to optimise the environmental benefits that we might get from trying to achieve future energy pathways. There aren't very many equations in it, there are a lot of maps, because we tend to think about things very much in terms of sort of spatial modelling and so forth. So this is what we're going to try and sort of talk about. We're going to talk about some of the different kinds of challenges that we see in terms of land use and landscape futures, some of the things that need to be thought about. We're going to sort of explain the context for the Advent project that we've both been working on. We're going to say a little bit about possible future energy pathways and how we've gone about modelling the implications of those, the way we've gone about trying to achieve some spatial optimization results and what they start to show, and some of the next steps of what we're doing and the new project that we're going to be doing as part of the Landscape Decisions programme. So we want to start with 3 challenges. And the first of these challenges is something I think you could basically describe as the energy challenge, because the UK has now got a history of trying to make commitments to look at ways in which greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced. And this started particularly with the Climate Change Act in 2008, and it's continued through the various carbon budgets, and right up to date, literally sort of last month, was the government signing up to the idea of a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target for 2050. That is a big step change compared to anything that had existed as a target previously, and it's going to have all sorts of implications. But we're looking basically at ways of decarbonising the UK energy system. And that has been changing anyway, if you look at the recent history. So there's something called the Digest of UK Energy Statistics, DUKES for short, which is one of the main sort of official publications of different sources of data on electricity produced each year. And this is just a graph based on data from that going through to 2017. And it shows the electricity supplied by what's called major power producers. These are the businesses whose main role is basically producing electricity and heat. They are actually becoming less important as part of our overall energy system. Our energy system is becoming more decentralized. But also, if you look at what those big businesses were using to provide our electricity, you can see that it's starting to change in all sorts of ways. So, for example, the bottom bars are the proportion from coal, and that has dropped very steeply since particularly about 2012, 2013. It's basically going to disappear completely in the next couple of years. We have a sizable band from gas. We have a varying contribution from nuclear, but the thing that's really noticeable is the increased contribution from different sorts of renewables. There's always been a hydro component, but the really big change in the last few years has been the level of contribution from wind and solar. Yeah.
It's the total is going down also quite a lot for 2012.
Yes.
Does that mean we're importing energy, or are we genuinely?
We're using less. We are becoming more energy efficient as a society. Now, that might well change in the future. This is electricity. This is not all energy, right? At the moment, we have a lot of heat that comes from other sources. there are a lot of people still using oil and gas for heating. Yeah, that is going to change. Our demand for electricity might actually go up again, right? And keep in mind that, as I said, this is major power producers. There are other power producers as well, yeah? And these major power producers are not as important as they were 20 years ago, yeah? Instead of producing like 95% of the UK's power, they're now producing sort of 85%.
My question was, has coal been replaced by gas in the last couple of years?
There's an element of that, yes, but basically, particularly, there's very few coal-fired power stations, and they're being phased out very, very fast. Yeah. So there was what's called a dash for gas. Yeah. And then that started to change as well. Yeah. You can plot out where the individual power stations are. We have a lot of power stations that were built 20 or 30 years ago, and a significant number of them are basically coming to the end of their operational life. Yeah.
So if you have solar panels on your house, those are not in here.
Oh no, that's nothing to. The kind of solar farm that you're.
That's a big farm.
That's
right?
a big solar
power.
solar panels on your house for hot water is not in that statistic.
Well, you could bundle all the individuals doing that as well as a little bar.
Yes, but
Is that large, that bar? If you would do that.
it's getting bigger.
Okay.
Yeah, it was tiny. Yeah.
So our interest is going to be on the effect on land use in the end, because this is environment and energy. So that's great. All the stuff you put on top of people's houses doesn't have a massive effect on land use.
No, that's correct.
Okay. But this is only one component.
But and it does in the sense that if that goes up, then you need less land. So
Yes.
that it's not quite true what you're saying, because
Yeah.
that means that you can use the land for something else. So it
I
depends
think
exactly
that's
how you
in the
interpret it.
models that they, which we'll see in a minute on.
Okay. Anyway, so our system is changing already, and it's going to change even more. And we have some changes in that are going to have all sorts of consequences. For a long time, we've actually been reliant on what you might call subterranean energy sources. Uranium, coal, oil, gas, but all coming from below ground. Okay? In relative terms, the importance of those is going down. We are putting more emphasis on renewables, but those renewables have much lower power densities than, say, things like oil and gas or uranium. They're about something like a fossil fuel is typically got a power density 2 to 5 orders of magnitude higher than renewables. The kind of changes you can see on that graph. What that means is, as our energy system is changing, we're going to have bigger spatial footprints for the energy system. Okay? We're going to need more land for some of these types of renewables. And we're going to have a more decentralized energy system. For a long time, we've had an energy system which was basically a relatively small number of big nuclear, coal, oil or gas power stations on the end of the main high voltage electricity transmission network. And we're rapidly moving away from that. We still have some of that infrastructure, but we have a lot more energy generation coming from sources that have lower power densities, like wind and solar and bioenergy. And we have a lot more of that electricity generation not connected to the high voltage transmission network, but the lower voltage distribution network. The proportion of electricity generation on the distribution network is now over 30%. And it was, perhaps 19 or 20%, no more than 5 years ago. So it's a big change in terms of what's happening. And the consequence of all of that is that there's now much more potential for changes in the energy system to interact with other land uses. that perhaps wouldn't have been a concern 20 or 30 years ago. But because of the way the energy system itself is changing and these decarbonisation objectives are rising, energy is going to be another one of these issues, alongside agriculture, climate change, etc., that's going to need to be thought about in a landscape context. So that's one challenge. Then we have an environmental challenge in terms of the emphasis that there's been in trying to look at ways of incorporating ideas about natural capital, the stocks of different types of natural assets, and the flows of benefits that come from them, the ecosystem services and the benefits that they provide, into decision making. And you can see the start of that thinking with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. In the UK context, you can see it in the Natural Environment White Paper. You can see it in research projects like the National Ecosystem Assessment follow-on phase that both Brett and I worked on. Much more recently, this year, basically, or last year, the government has basically published the idea of a 25-year plan for the environment. It is extremely unusual for governments or politicians to think in terms of 25-year timeframes. Yeah, that is a big change. But that plan is quite interesting in terms of what it talks about and what it doesn't talk about. This is something that someone else did. They took the executive summary from that 25-year environment plan and they basically made a word cloud of it. Okay? So this is basically picking out the words that were used most frequently in the executive summary of that 25-year plan. That's quite interesting. You know, the largest one is will. Yeah. The next ones are sort of government, environment, health, plan, natural, etc. If you can find energy on that diagram, you're doing very well. Okay. I think it's probably hidden away there somewhere. But the point is basically, and other people have done research on this, there's an entire tradition of sort of environment and climate change scenarios that don't say that much about energy. And there's an entire tradition of work on energy futures that don't say much about the environment beyond carbon dioxide. And there's a need to sort of link these sorts of things together. So that's where we see one of our key challenges. And then we have another challenge, which is about how we make decisions. And all of these sorts of things. So there's going to be a lot of baton passing in this.
So I was planning to talk tomorrow on sort of economics and land use decision making, but I've put some of that in today's because I think it's relevant and a good place to start with thinking about how we've gone about the project that Andrew's going to talk about. The approach that's being used to try and think about how we start bringing some of those considerations of environment and energy together in this case, but it could be thinking about agri-environment and the environment and agri-environment, agriculture together, is this thing called the natural capital approach. And that might feel a bit unnatural to you. What we're really doing in this approach is we're going to try and think about nature as if it's like an economy, as if it's like a factory producing stuff. Okay, so that's the essence of what's going on here. And people don't really like that idea, but it's really just a way of conceptualising what we're trying to do here. And it's useful because it allows us to break down the elements of what's going on and get at the things that are really important in decision making. So, we know how we can think about what's a good decision when we're just thinking about what's going on and what we normally think of as the economy, because we have a good model, a good understanding of how the economy works. It is very complicated. But essentially, you can break it down into the following boxes. Now, this is sort of undergraduate first lessons in economics, so I hope lots of you know this. But we have a whole series of economic processes, say firms that come together to build things, universities that come together to create excellently educated students, firms trading, restaurants, washing, supermarkets, a whole bunch of economic processes. But forget these to work, to get these processes together, the thing that's happening is they're drawing on the capitals, the stocks of things we use to make things that exist in the economy. So we've got buildings, and we've got steel, and we've got roads, we've got computers, and all these other things. So these processes draw down on our capitals that exist in the economy. We think about our economy as having a whole set of capitals, and we count and we value these things, and we count and we value what's going on in here. And one thing to understand is that these economic processes are geared up for two things. One is to restore these capitals. When you think about these ideas, intermediate goods and services. So you think about what a university does is it produces more human capital, so it's actually putting back stuff into our capital stocks. That's what we're attempting to do. And lots of other firms, such as building firms, are creating more capital, which is then going to come into an economic production process. So within economics, we have this idea of intermediate goods and services and final goods and services. So final goods and services are the things that come out of some of these processes. I don't know, holidays, that's on my mind, coffee, shoes, cars, washing machines, etc. And we care about those because those ultimately are the things that we get well-being from. So these are the things that in economics we say people consume. Okay? They're things, and consumption, it has a bad sort of name outside economics. It really just means the things that people want and need. And when they get provided to them, they feel better. So we call them goods. There's also stuff that you can come to people that they feel worse about that. We call those bads. Okay? So this is just a really simple model of how an economy works. So you ask an economist to understand what the environment is, and this is what they do. They take that economic production process and they say, well, can we think about the environment in the same way? And that's useful because we can start disentangling what it's doing. And if our goal, as it would be for an economist, is to try and think about this issue of human well-being, then we can go from that model of the economy to something which is, does the same thing for the environment. And that's what I've done. So here we've got natural capitals. So these are the stocks. By stocks, I mean they last from period to period. Okay? They're not just consumed as we go through. So we've got, I don't know, coal, habitats, fish stocks, soil stocks, water, air, etc., which are drawn down by environmental processes. So a lot of talk about these environmental processes, flooding, fish, decomposition, I don't know, all these other things. And a lot of these processes are part of this natural system. So economics puts all this over here. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out, a lot of things we've talked about. I don't know, I'm always talking to ecologists and hydrologists, and they're coming out with things which are in this process, you know, we're thinking about how the natural system works within itself. But from the economics point of view, or I probably should say from the decision point of view, what we're interested in is not necessarily those flows, but the flows of stuff that comes out here, which in economics we've called these final environmental goods and services for, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. They're now called ecosystem services. Okay? So this language has been around, this model's been around for absolute ages, but this is the way of thinking about it. So there's certain things that come out of here that people care about. Certain things that people care about, and they could be goods or bads. I'm just going to stick on the good side. So we've got fish, we've got recreation opportunities, we've got pollination, etc. And they feed into the things that people care about. So with that model, we can now start thinking about, well, what is it that we want? We want to organise this production system, this environmental production system, in order to achieve the best outcomes for human well-being. So that's the basic idea behind the natural capital approach. Of course.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You're probably going to address it. But in the previous model, without the green, your goods in the end had a value which the market determines. Now with here is how do you determine what the value is of recreation, which is, because you usually don't pay for it unless it's the entry to a park, right? And it's more clear. But how do you value that? Because that's
I'm going
in
to
the
talk
eye of the beholder and with a lot of
absolutely.
uncertainty.
So
And
I'm
that
going to talk about
depends-
that in detail tomorrow. But
Okay.
basically, there is a concept that people have value. People can feel this value. If it feels better to me, that's value. And just go with me now that we can put a measure on that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then just go with me that we can think of some way of aggregating that
I'm
across
happy with
people.
that. And
We'll deal with that
tomorrow
tomorrow. And tomorrow it will be, there'll be philosophy and morals, and we'll probably get into some rows about how it works.
oh,
But
yeah.
imagine we've got some way. So, you see, well,
That's fine.
if you think about things that are traded in markets, I haven't got an example here. Okay, so you do pay a price for them, I agree. But that price can be really low. So how much do you pay for water? I don't know, a couple of pennies per litre. But the value to you, the level of well-being it brings to you is much bigger. So in economics, we distinguish absolutely between this idea of money and price. This is why I've been connecting to people. I think Danny's had this a few times with me, when he's been talking about prices and finance and this sense of value. So all the time here I'm talking about human well-being. I'm not talking about money. We're going to measure it in money, but it's a different concept. So the thing is, these goods and services coming out of the economy, they're good, people like them because they get value from them. They also have to pay money for them. But that's an independent thing. It helps in, those signals help in making sure the economy works well to deliver the things people want, because people won't pay for them if they're not things they value. But we're talking about this concept of value. We call it economic value, some people call it social welfare, some people call it human well-being. It's this sense of things being better.
Is there a reason why it would have to necessarily be measured in monetary terms? You could do it any other. You could
Any units you want. Any units you want.
But in some sense that doesn't matter. In the end, you put a number on it, and whether that number has the unit pounds or breadths,
Yeah.
I don't care, because in the end it puts in a comparison. That's what matters.
You don't care, but the decision maker cares.
No, sure,
Because
but
you
if
can compare more when the
But
units are
if it doesn't matter if it's expressed in breadths, right?
I know, but that's okay for you. But it's very easy to confuse these two issues, price and value,
Yes.
isn't it? When you do it in money, because we normally think of money as
Yeah.
about price.
No, I think money is the clearest probably for most people, but it doesn't need to be money.
It very much doesn't need to be money. There are some real sort of issues around using money to do this as well that we'll talk about, and then the aggregation issue. But should we do that tomorrow?
That's fine.
I'm sort of planning to do that tomorrow. And some things are more defensible than others, but we'll see how it's doing. I'm not here to sort of necessarily defend some of these approaches, though I think they're more defensible than the alternatives. I think that's where we go. Anyhow, so this is what we've got. So this really simple idea of what our two economies are doing, our natural economy and economic economy, human economy, are driving human well-being through these flows of goods and services to humans. And of course, we know that there's loads of interactions going this way, and we know there's loads of interactions going this way. So pollution, land cover change, and this is really what we're thinking about in the Advent project and some of the agri-environment stuff, is the way in which economic decisions are going to drive changes in the environment system, and how that affects the flows of goods and services, final ecosystem goods and services, or environmental goods and services to humanity. Why do we care about this? Well, it's fine. We don't really mind about it until we're starting to make decisions. So there's things we might care about. We might want to understand what's happening under some sort of drivers that are coming from outside. Actually, just knowing that is pretty irrelevant unless there's something you can do about it. So in any context in which economists or decision makers care about this stuff, it's when there's something you can do about it, when there's a policy, a lever of change. So all this doesn't make any difference really in decision processes unless you're thinking about what can we actually do to intervene in these systems in some way, which could change here or here or here, and we care at the end about what this level of human well-being is. So I think it's true to say that up until probably the 90s, we just didn't even think about that top level thing. So we weren't concerned about those final goods and services, and all we were concerned about was what happens as we went through this part of the economy. And you can think of that about thinking of running policy for changes in market value, or changes in market value. This is similar to thinking about measuring the functioning of economy through GDP, gross domestic product, or other measures of the total productivity of this part of the economy. So I'm not going to criticise GDP, because GDP is actually a wonderful measure of how well that part of the economy is functioning. But it's not a good measure of how well human well-being is getting on, because it ignores everything that's going on at the top there. So we're ignoring that. And I don't think there's anyone in the world would say to you, I should just be, if I care about human well-being, concerned about what's going on in this part of the jewel economy, as it were. There's another thing you could say is that you could think, well, we don't really care about human well-being. What we care about is intrinsic value. In fact, I think Jenny and I had a bit of a chat about this as well. Yeah, well, this idea of intrinsic value. Again, intrinsic value is a very difficult one, and again, it's something we've got a massive debate about. And if you really want to try to define it properly, it has to be this is a value that is somehow held by non-humans for it to be intrinsic. If it was held by humans, it would be a flow of goods and services. So if I care about habitats, or I care about species, then that's a flow of goods and services. So if I just think they should be there, and I think it's a value that comes to me, I feel better because of it. So it's over here. But if you think there's some sets of values that we should be taking account in our decision making that don't accrue to humans, they accrue to others, we've really in a real pickle. So if you go down that, I'm not saying you can't think that, measuring it is almost impossible. What do we measure? Who do we care about? And thinking about how we would bring that together into a decision process immediately asks the question, well, if we could measure this, which we couldn't, I don't see how we could sort of measure the value that an ecosystem or an elephant or an impala or a lion held for, we just can't do it. So even if we could do it, we'd then have to ask ourselves the question, well, how much are we prepared to trade off between the value that nature feels for itself and the value that humans get, not from nature? I mean, we've already taken that in, which leads to some very, very tricky questions. So the fundamental basis of this process of decision making is that we care about human well-being, and we'll talk more about what that's made up of, but it can definitely, most certainly includes the fact that we just care about the environment, even if it doesn't give us some physical flow of goods and services as a result. We just like to know the environment's there. And I think when we talk about biodiversity conservation in this country, we're in the position of thinking about that sort of flow. We would prefer to live in a country in which we have good habitats and we have good distribution, diverse species existing in the country. But we do because we care about it, not necessarily because they care about it.
Seems like those things could have, like they would have value, but you wouldn't know it till they were gone. Like we like to have a good environment because it makes us feel nice, but if all biodiversity disappeared, we would lose actual goods and services that the environment provides that has value, but we don't know what that value is now.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's, well, yeah, it's massive. But it doesn't change the model.
Right.
It's just that we've got uncertainty over these flows of goods and services. And probably because if you went back to that, so if you go back to this, it's because these processes are so complicated.
Right.
So I'm frequently asking, ecologists in particular about when they say, well, it's really important that we have high soil biota or diversity of this and this. I say, well, okay, brilliant. I understand, and you can measure that. But have we got any idea how, in the end, that's going to deliver changes in food or changes in other things that we care about? And at the moment, my feeling is from talking to them that no, they're pretty good at measuring some of these measures or flows of changes within the system and how these systems work, but how that translates into things that are decision relevant is really unknown. So, and you're right, we've got to try and do this under the fact that there's a great uncertainty about the fact that if we ignore those things, we could be running down things that do have value for us, and that should be in there. I absolutely agree.
So, I mean, a related issue, it sounds like the definition of value is quite subjective in a way. So people have to know that it has value for it to have value.
Yeah, it's individually
So
subjective.
that makes it, especially in these times, extremely dynamic concept, doesn't it? Where people are becoming more aware of things. And the values that, so presumably the value of the environment has changed as a result of all the stuff that's been going on with Greta and Extinction Rebellion and all the other stuff. It must be a really rapidly varying landscape you're trying to get around.
Well, that's the nature of political decision making.
Yeah.
If you care, and economic decision making, if you care about this and people are changing what they care about, possibly through the provision of information, and just changing preferences in society, your decision processes have to change. And these aren't absolutes. This comes back to a discussion that Peter and I were having, which was very interesting about the stability of these preferences. And calling these preferences is my sense of what, this is another word he's making, my sense of what I prefer, what's good. I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow as well. I can talk a little bit about it tomorrow, or I can set up some questions and we can debate it.
Yeah, but the models and the analysis and economists do to calculate these values are static.
Right.
So it's hard to predict how, or capture how it will change, and there is basic to do. So you're not supposed to do one a year and then another year.
Right.
So you just have to assume, most of the time they assume that they will be constant over time, or just have to assume some sort of dynamics in it, that it makes sense to you.
Yeah. No, I agree. But so there's the model of what we're trying to do, and practical difficulties of implementing, which again I think we'll come to tomorrow and show some of the limitations as well as the successes of attempting to quantify this thing. So I mean, the one thing they often do is think that this valuation of environmental services is related to wealth, and as the wealth of people rises, they are more prepared to warrant trading off other things in order to have a good environment. You see that elsewhere quite dramatically in records of expenditure of governments on environmental protection and how it relates to the wealth of a country, for example. But let's not get sidetracked, we've got a lot to get through. So where was I? Yeah, I was just talking about this. We dealt with intrinsic value and how, well, even if you believe it exists, I'm not certain. I mean, if you look at the moral philosophers in this area, they say value. I'm trying to appeal to a higher intelligence here, but the value is a human construct. That it's a human construct. It's not something you can just take on and put on the environment or species or habitats. So if we really are interested in this idea of value, it's to do with human value. Right, where's this going? So intrinsic value, yeah, and then really, if we're really concerned about making good decisions because we care about human well-being, then we want to be putting those two things together. We've got to care about how our policy decisions work through both of these different systems and have an effect both through the market and through the non-market. So I'm thinking particularly this environmental thing about things which don't get traded in markets. There's a bit of detail there, but I think we're pretty happy with that. And we call that economic value. So that's very confusing for people as well, but that can be called social welfare, or it can be it can be called social welfare, or measures similar to that. Right, so that's the natural capital approach. With that understanding, which I hope many of you came to this with, I was trying to think about what I think are the key elements of this question of making decisions for land use. And of course, it starts with thinking about the possibility that we could do something to change. There's some change in land use, some change in management. And a lot of the things we've looked at and concentrated on think about this reaction of environmental systems to this, ecological, hydrological, forest growth, etc. So that's really the realm of the natural scientists thinking about those two things. And of course, that could be driven by things like climate change. So it's not just land use management, there's other things going on in the background. Mark will come in a second. So that's definitely one element. It's definitely an important element, is understanding that modelling environmental systems and their reaction to land use. But it's not the only element. So I think what we've just seen is that we can't just stop thinking just about the environmental systems. There's this translation, making sure that what's coming out of those turns into these measures of ecosystem services, or what I call final environmental goods and services. So this turning those environmental models so that the outputs are in decision-relevant units is absolutely crucial. If you want to be involved in influencing decisions, you've got to be coming out with things that people care about, these ecosystem services. Then the most important part, and that's not because this is what I do, is that we've got to be able to change this into some measure of well-being. So how much do we care about these? We've got to put this into some sort of metric, and I'm going to call it value, that can be used in decision making. They've got to somehow be comparable across the different things we could do, because we're going to, at some point, if we're going to make a decision, there's going to be trade-offs across these different things that can happen. There's costs that might be happening in the economy, there's benefits might be happening in one ecosystem, certain costs and benefits in another. You've got to make a decision. And so you either put them into some unit and have a way of comparing them, and this is what valuation is all about, or you make a decision and you're doing it implicitly. So you never get around that. You never get around thinking there's a trade-off to be made. So these things have to be done. We either do it explicitly with the benefit of our knowledge, or we ignore it. And I think doing it explicitly, and I'll go into some detail tomorrow about why I think that's an important step. You might argue, we'll see, it'll be good to see. So that's at least three really major things you have to do if you want to influence decisions. It doesn't stop there though, because these are usually complicated decisions. If we're thinking about land use and stuff that Andrew's going to show you in a second, we're not just thinking about, is it this or this? We're thinking about, well, we could have a sort of a pattern of land use changes across the country, many different land uses going on in different areas. So we've got to make some decisions about what we do and where we do it. And that's quite complicated. So there has to be some sort of process of deciding what's a good outcome. We've got so many different things we could be doing on the land, and this is the idea of some form of optimization. Again, we'll talk about this in a second. So this step, I don't think we've talked about enough yet, and I guess that's because I'm quite interested in how we might do this. It's all well and good thinking we can go this way and think about this is, I think you guys are calling it reverse modelling, but this is some way we can go back and say, well, what would we like to achieve? What would this land use look like if what we care about is this notion of human welfare? But that's not it. So that's four elements I think you have to say. All of these are really important elements of land use decision making. But that would assume that we have a policy which could impose what we believe to be the optimum. I'm thinking land use here. That we could say we want a woodland there, we want natural grass there, we want agriculture there, we want bioenergy crops there. In fact, that's what we do in the stuff that we're just about to show you. But really, we don't do that. It doesn't work like that in this country. It works through the fact that we have certain policy instruments, and they're relatively crude instruments, levers we can play with. They can define areas and say you can't do something in here. We do that with nitrate vulnerable zones, for example. They can push around subsidies, or they can have in different forms of tax or fines. So we have a set of instruments that we can use. We can refine them every time we do these. I call them instruments. You can also call them mechanisms, economic mechanisms. I'm thinking about an auction in this case, it doesn't matter. But we can play around with those levers, and those are designed to affect the decisions of the decision makers who determine what happens on the land. So there's two big things here. And these land managers aren't just responding to our drivers, to the policy drivers, they're responding to the fact that the climate change they're adapting to, potentially if they know enough about it, and certainly market conditions are a huge influence there. So understanding that, the interaction between instruments and land managed decisions is the next, and is the other huge thing you have to do if you want to influence decisions. These things only happen if you have an instrument that comes through there. So designing instruments, how can we get there? So if I was thinking about it, I'd say those are the 5 key steps. It's not just here. It's not just thinking about this and the modelling that goes on in here. We have to get that right. But to get to decisions, you've got to go through at least these 4 other steps, or 3 other steps to get to.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Economic valuation clearly is really important, but it's probably a thing we're not, we said before, it's just subjective. I value things differently than you value things. Somehow we have to make a decision as a country, as a government, about how to balance those different valuations.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Should we do it tomorrow? And that
Okay.
is specifically what I talk about tomorrow.
No, that's fine.
But you're absolutely right. This is a completely subjective measure, which is its strength.
Yeah.
So this isn't experts saying what's right. This isn't dictators saying what's right. It's an incredibly inclusive and democratic process, because it says your value counts, as does your value, as does your value, as does your value. It takes account of everyone's value in society. So this is really important that this method works. We're trying to understand how it affects everyone. And one of the strengths of this method, therefore, is that it allows us to understand how different policies affect different groups in societies in different ways as well. So there's this myth that the economic valuation somehow doesn't tell us anything about distributional outcomes. Actually, it's incredibly powerful to understand the distributional outcomes. I would say that's its strength rather than its weakness. Again, I'll talk about that tomorrow if that's okay.
That's fine.
If I may.
Yeah.
In practice, rather often constraints. I mean, this looks like, I don't like the word, but I'm using it anyway, holistic view. But in practice, it might be that the budgets, for example, are columnar. There might be a budget for bees, but in your ecosystem, you have to take into account beavers and bees together. So, but there is no money for the beavers, so that part of the, that doesn't really matter, but that part can't be funded. Well, from your overall model, you should promote bees and beavers in tandem, and that puts a constraint on the kind of the shorter term decisions. Well, this is in some sense the longer term plan. I mean, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but
Well, you're coming into this economy or this decision-making process with a set of budgets in place which are determined by previous decision-making processes.
yeah, or you need to change the budgets for the way budgets are allocated,
And how
right,
you
in a
gonna
different
do
way,
that?
so that you have links between different parts of different budgets.
So 2 things, and we could probably run over this.
Yeah.
Right? There's 2 things. One is the whole point of the process is to be able to illustrate to people that the way in which the budgets is now being distributed is inefficient.
Yes.
There's ways in which we could do better. If you open that budget up to do this or transfer this into here, and it's that direct comparison. I mean, this is so crucial to what's going on here, is that there isn't a budget for the environment, there's a budget for the country. And that means that what happens is the environment has to make its case up against all the other things we could use our limited resources to spend on. So it's not that you're just saying it's beavers versus bees, it's beavers versus bees versus education,
I know,
defence,
I
and
know,
those
it's
other
just
things.
an example.
But you've got to be able to make good cases. And in that world, that's the reality of decision making, which doesn't seem silly. That decision making should be driven by what delivers the most value to society. Environment's got to state its case. But the process should allow you to go through. And if we have all this, and we can go to policymakers and say, well, look, if you put this instrument in place with that budget, you would have this much effect on human welfare or economic value compared to what you're achieving at the moment. That's exactly what the purpose of this is.
But that's why it's important to investigate the effects of different constraints versus no constraints, right? Because then you can say, well, those constraints shouldn't be there because they obscure, they block going to the alleged optimum, which will have uncertainty, of course.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. So I think you're thinking about what the policy is, how much money should I have in here. At the moment it's zero. My policy is not to spend anything. But
I'll try and be quite quick because I think I'm moving too much. So, the context for that is this project that we've been involved in doing the last 4 years now. So this is a project called Advent. The whole idea was to try and look at ways of taking different sorts of conceptual frameworks and modelling tools, kinds of things that Brett has been sort of just explaining, and particularly to try and link together the analysis of different sorts of UK future energy pathways with considerations relating to the value of natural capital. That's what we're trying to do, to bring these sorts of ideas together. It's quite a big project. It's got 7 partner institutions. It's got about 35 people involved in it, and it's been running for a while. This is our sort of timeline of what we've been doing. We've got 7 PhD students as part of the program. We've been looking at different ways of quantifying impacts of energy system components. We've been looking at impacts in the UK, and as will become apparent, it's also actually important to think of the impacts of UK policy elsewhere in the world. We're currently here, so we've got about a year of our project to run. We've finished a lot of this bulge of activity. We're now trying to bring a lot of these things together, and some of what we're going to show you in the next few minutes is some of the results starting to emerge from all of that. What we've got to do is have a way of taking energy pathways and then trying to assess their implications for natural capital in terms of changes, for example, in the value of different sorts of environmental benefits. So we have to start from, well, what are the kinds of energy futures that we might be looking at? So there's a whole range of different types of energy system models. There's something called the UK Times model, which is used a lot by, for example, BEIS, Committee on Climate Change, various businesses. There are other models of these type. Basically, what they tend to do, they are a least cost optimization model. You put in a series of objectives, you have details of a whole series of possible technologies and their costs and their ability to generate heat and power, and you run this optimization model, and over time it gives you information about how the energy system might change, what investment would be needed in new forms of generation capacity, what the implications would be for costs, for carbon levels, and so on and so forth. We haven't tried to produce another one of those models. There's lots of them. What we've tried to do is develop a way of taking some of the output from those models and try and look at a way of assessing the natural capital implications of those outputs. So the project that we've been doing is part of the research programme of the UK Energy Research Centre that was funded separately by NERC. So what we've done is we've actually taken the output from a report which UKERC published in 2018 on the security of UK energy futures, where they took 6 different energy pathways, scenarios if you like, and they estimated what they would mean in terms of the kind of profile of, say, electricity generation by 2050 from major power producers and other sectors of the economy, and what they would look like in terms of the types of technologies that would be involved, the costs, the extent to which they would meet decarbonisation objectives, and so on and so forth. And these are outputs that we've been able to get access to through collaboration with the people at University College London who did this project. Basically, we have a very large number of spreadsheets which which tell you something, for instance, about the investment in different types of technologies in 5-year time steps to get to these kinds of objectives. Very simply, these are 5 pathways that sort of span quite a big range. The energy island is sort of the kind of extreme Brexit scenario. It's the best way I can describe it. All right. So it's really, the UK becoming, very insular. It even actually brings coal back into the energy mix. These sorts of low carbon pathways are ones that meet not the net zero target, but the kind of carbon budget target for 2050. But they do it in slightly different ways. So this one includes things like carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy carbon capture and storage, in other words, negative emissions. This one has no carbon capture and storage in it. This one has no negative emissions. It produces very different sort of technology mixes, very different amounts of electricity being generated by the major power producers. And something like this technology optimism one is a very, very decentralized, very, very renewables heavy system. That is the closest one of the 6 that we've modelled that gets to a net zero emissions target. It doesn't get there by 2050, gets there by about 2080.
And why are these 6 not supposed to deliver the same total amount?
Because you need different amounts by 2050 under different pathways. And the role, other societal changes will take place. Okay? And that will vary the amount of electricity that's required, and the role of the major power producers will vary across the scenarios.
Yeah.
Okay?
You're surprised that with this extreme Brexit scenario that we become less requiring of electricity.
Yeah, it varies a lot.
One of the things going on here as well is generation capacity.
Yes.
So that if you boost up the quantity of wind and solar, you've got to have more capacity in things like nuclear to make up for the fact that you sometimes don't have it. So with Energy Island, because it's all coal and nuclear, we don't have to worry about that, because we can just switch those on continuously. As soon as you come across these other ones which have got lots of wind and solar in it, means you've got to have more capacity in reserve.
Okay. Anyway, so we
I just wonder, does any of these scenario influence uncertainty in terms of innovation of technology? Technology is not going to
only in the sense that it's built into the costs of things. Yeah. So it's built into the model. It's built into the technology cost profile over time. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. So the problem with these types of energy system models is that they're much better at assessing changes over time than over space. They're the kinds of things that are used to produce national estimates, or if you're lucky, regional estimates. Okay? So this is very powerful in terms of, say, taking the UK and treating it as a pinhead and saying, how might this change over time? But that's becoming less and less viable as a set of starting assumptions when we have a more distributed system and a lot more use of renewables that have big land footprints. So what people have started to do is look at ways of coupling different sorts of models to start to investigate, for example, variations in constraints in terms of wind speeds, solar power, water resources, etc., and what that might mean for the cost of electricity generation. And there's a very nice example of a paper published a couple of years ago by a team from University College London and Cambridge that does that. But they did it for 17 regions of the country. And for the kind of thing that we're doing, trying to look at the environmental costs and benefits, we need a finer spatial resolution again. And so we have to try and take a sort of slightly different kind of modelling approach. So we've got our UKTM, we've got our security pathways. We know what the existing electricity generation capacity is. We're only really focusing on what we've done in one part of the energy system. It's quite complicated enough to do that. We can say, well, what's the additional capacity required at different times? We have a lot of data had to create, in many cases, on the electricity network, all sorts of spatial data on land use, resources, siting constraints, all these kinds of things. We can bring these things together, and we've got basically a spatial optimization model. Brett will talk about this more in a minute, where the basis of that optimization can vary. It can be on the basis of the market values, kind of thing that Brett was explaining a minute ago, or it can be a much broader welfare basis, where you're bringing in both the market and the non-market values. From that, we can generate sets of new site locations, and we can undertake economic valuation of them. One of the things we're often asked about is, well, why are you doing a spatial optimization? Because in the past, a lot of the ways this kind of analysis has been done, say for bioenergy, has been to say, okay, take a load of spatial data, look at the areas covered by different constraints, overlay them together and see what's left, okay? The problem is that doesn't work, right? Because, I mean, here's an example. I've taken 7 different sorts of features that you might want to, for example, say, well, we don't want to do energy generation on these. The best grade agricultural land, which is about 47% of the 210,000 kilometre squares in England. Woodland areas, peat soils, national parks and AONBs, open green space, national nature reserve, urban areas. You know, if you add up those 7 numbers, you get to over 100% straight away. Yeah, right? Actually, if you overlay them together, you get this sort of remaining land. You can see where it is. That's about 16% of England, 37,500 hectares, right? But if you think about that 37,500, if you look at those scenarios and you just say, well, how much land do you need? Those scenarios, if you just took very roughly the footprint of the kinds of technologies involved, you probably need somewhere in the order of 10,000 square kilometres to meet those targets. And then you've got people like the Committee on Climate Change, who've done all this other sort of land use modelling, which say that basically urban areas are going to expand by about 4% by 2050. Afforestation is going to expand by 60%, and there's probably going to be a reduction in the area of agricultural land. So you can't just do this because you won't be able to put anything anywhere, right? And then your second problem is, okay, you've got this remaining land, but is it in the right place? Because if you want to generate wind energy, well, the wind speed is very, very fundamental. And that's, you know, a map of the wind speeds across Britain and where the current wind energy generation is. You know, it's not spread across the country. It's very strongly concentrated in the western side of the country, and particularly parts of Scotland. And the same is true in a completely different way for solar. You know, you won't get very much solar generation in the Highlands of Scotland. Completely different, but you'll get a lot of potential, particularly down on the south coast of England. So it's no good just saying, well, where's the available land? Because you can't do it. You can't do it in terms of those resources. You also can't do it in terms of our capacity of our existing electricity transmission and distribution network. This is something that we took very little account of when we were initially doing our proposal for this project. And the more we've done the project, the more important it gets. This is actually what the high resolution, high voltage transmission lines look like around the country. There's an awful lot of historical influence in that pattern. You know, it just doesn't go down into the southern tip of Cornwall. It just doesn't go into mid-Wales. It doesn't go into very large parts of eastern England. It's very driven by, you know, where there's a few major sections of population, where there have been big power stations in the past, and where there were nuclear power stations built in the 1960s and 1970s. Very driven by that. And then you've got to know where your substations are. Because if you're building solar farms, wind farms, plants that are using bioenergy, you've got to be able to connect them to the network. So you've got to work out where the substations of different capacities are. We've actually had to create that database. It didn't exist. There's about 6,800 substations there. It's not only a matter of where the substation is, but the substation capacity is important, because there's big parts of the country where actually the substations haven't got very much additional capacity to connect to them. So you've got to bring all these other kinds of issues in and then try and optimise across all these sorts of issues. So the baton gets passed back to Brendan at this point.
Right, so I was responsible for part of this project which tried to bring this together. And it brings together in what's come to be known as the Natural Environment Evaluation Suite of Models. I'll talk you through briefly what those are, so this makes sense. It's a gridded model, or set of models, that talk to each other in certain ways. Which in this case we're looking at a 1 kilometre grid. A lot of the models are estimated at 2 kilometre grids, so there's some downscaling going on for some of the models. So we're looking at what's going on and we're making decisions over what to do in each of these locations. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made here. Well, are we going to grow biocrops in this cell? Are we going to put a solar farm in this cell? Are we going to put biocrops which are going to be feeding carbon capture storage? So carbon capture storage is this idea. There's certain places around the UK where you could put really big biocrop burning plants, and those could then capture the carbon, stick them in pipes, and either ship them off to the North Sea or go into these pipes under the North Sea. So there's that technology going on as well. Or wind farms. We're thinking about onshore wind farms. We're leaving some things out. Nuclear isn't in here. We're not dealing with offshore wind as yet. And the second set of sort of spatial units that are here are a set of hydrological models developed by our hydrologist who came to work with us on this for Lorena. I've forgotten the second name, that's why I'm hesitating. Lorena Lorenzoni, no, that's wrong. Sorry, that's terrible. I'll get in a second. Age, that's what I'm blaming on. So a series of calibrated hydrological models going all the way across England and Wales. I'll show you that now for two reasons. One is that we're in the process of getting these done for Scotland. So we haven't got Scotland in there, that's going to drive some of the results. And plus, they're only calibrated up until the last point on the rivers network in which we have river flow data. So everything that's going downstream in these locations tends to be tidal. The hydrology gets completely very difficult, and so we're not dealing with those bits in the models as it stands. So there's limitations in what's in there, but there's a lot in there as it goes. So this is the set of models that comes together. At the highest level, I'll show you this in a little bit more detail, we look at land cover within each cell and we divide it up into these four basic things that are going on there. And those are determined. Those are determined by information that's coming from the Land Cover Map 2015. I'll show you that in detail in a second. The agricultural and forestry land is assumed to be under the management of some economic agent. So this is that first box as we're coming down policy into the economic agent. We have farmers or we have foresters who are making decisions as to what to do with the forest land or the agricultural land. And they're going to make decisions on arable grazing, it's going to come down to food, or on what sort of trees to plant if they're interested in timber. Those different decisions about what's going on in the land then end up giving us our land use composition at the cell level, or we can aggregate those up to give us a subcatchment level. And the subcatchment level then goes through these hydrological models to tell us something about surface water quality and quantity. I'm putting this on here, I'll come back to that in a second. This goes in, we're yet to get the biodiversity models, we're only just looking at some flood estimation models, but these are coming through to tell us something about carbon. We've got outdoor recreation valuation models. This has just been put in, I've understood, environmental non-use, and I've been talking with Jenny about ways in which we might use these biodiversity models as constraints. So this is a suite of models. We're going to have changes at the top. We're going to put things in basically on agricultural land and the results I'm going to show you, and that's going to feed through and we're going to get some idea of the ecosystem service consequences. But notice they're still partial, and nearly all these models are partial. We haven't got a full suite of ecosystem service valuations going on. We can get for some of these and how to do this. Recreation at the moment is only dealing with day trip recreation. Explain why that's important. There's another sort of recreation where people go and stay places overnight that I'm working on modelling on at the moment to try and tell us something about that sort of long term or that tourism sort of recreation as well. So that's the suite of models. Just to confirm what I was just telling you before, we take one of these cells and we start off from this idea that there's a proportion of it in agriculture, urban, woodlands, some sort of semi-natural land use of water, and that's determined for us from the land cover map data. And we say that any switch between those is going to be a policy decision, because the first instance is actually very difficult to move from any of those different land uses into another one without going through some sort of policy process. So those stay fixed, and then we're doing stuff on agricultural land or doing stuff there on woodland, which is what that's aggregating up. So this is the thing I was going to say a little bit more about. We're now thinking about this fact that we've got several things we could do to these different cells, and we're trying to think about, well, which combination of where do we put wind farms, where do we put solar is best. And we're doing this in the best way I know how, and it's one of the things that I'm interested in. Where do we put solar, where do we put biocrops? So we've got two types of biocrops, miscanthus or short rotation coppice, so a tree one and a grassy one. And we know something about the yields across the country of those. With this, we're working as well on the FabGGR project with Anna, is looking at some things to do with this biocrops and afforestation as a method of reducing carbon.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you maybe you were there yesterday with the other program, but why do you use a uniform mesh? That seems a bad idea, possibly, because some places have more stuff, so you would use, well, throwing in finite elements, so you give it more density. So because this is 1 kilometer square, right? So then, I mean, in the middle of London or in the middle of wherever, wouldn't you expect that you need more information, because you average out over the cell, I take it.
Yeah, everything within the cell is just treated as...
Is this hampering you? Is it important at all to have more varying resolution?
It's a great research question. I can, we've gone.
Well, that's exactly where you relate to. That's where you would
itself,
relate to
that
the
was
other program,
easy.
actually, because well, the guy Franco described that yesterday. I'm not sure if you were there, the other program.
Yes.
Yeah. So because
I was there, but I didn't follow exactly what he was describing.
No,
It's a really interesting question, and we thought about it in terms of our understanding of the size of farm decision-making units. We started off with a grid which was driven by the size of the farms. It turns out that the way in which some of the farming model worked, it didn't make any difference what the size of the square was, or the size of the
get more in here than farm.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Technologically, it's easy to do.
Yeah, but one of your problems is at the moment some of the data that you would want to drive it does not go down to those kinds of levels, agricultural census and stuff like that. Anyway,
and I'm talking about this being a grid. Actually, the models are working on different scales across everything. So the recreation model that underpins this works on paths networks and actual woodlands and locations. We just bring things together in a common unit to make it easy. And our decision process is going on at this 1 kilometre square resolution because we're thinking of changing. But I think it's it's a really interesting idea. No, we haven't investigated, and it would be
Sorry, can I
interesting
just
to
add
think
to
how to
that?
do it.
So I've been talking with one of the AFM PhD students, Seth Dunnett, about using that kind of approach. So just checking I understand. So like the mesh of varying sizes, you could use something like the Inler approach to fit that. Is that right? Inler, so integrated, nested, Laplace approximation. So you've got.
Well, I was just thinking you could use
like a triangular mesh type.
Yeah.
Well, I just agree.
So
You can vary the mesh density easily if that's desirable.
Yeah, so what Inler does is it solves the sort of spatial statistical problem by fitting a stochastic partial differential equation.
Yeah.
Solving that using finite elements. So it's exactly what Inler's suggesting. And it will build a mesh for you.
But you don't need to be triangles. Other meshes actually.
Yeah, I mean this
better,
one it
but
does
it's really
triangles,
messy.
but so I was just saying like
What do you mean by solve, Peter? What's it solving?
It's just a different way of solving it. Rather than on a regular grid, you do it on a varying grid, and the methods are efficient. But
So I'm trying to understand, just in practical terms, if I had a model of
You've got this grid,
some
you've got this grid, and you've got some spatial process across there. You want the grids to be correlated with one another. And what Inler will do is solve that spatial process, fit a Gaussian process basically across your map, changing the resolution and changing.
So just give me an example of what this process is that we're thinking
What
about.
can I draw it? Because it's that simple.
So I understand the thing. I'm just trying to think about how it.
That's simple. So I won't lift up the board because then that is here. But if you say if you have some function of something you like, I don't
Yeah, but
care.
what's that? I want an example of what we could use.
Beaver density. I don't care. I don't care. Row B, some density.
Yeah.
Then your regular grid captures this. But what if it's very spiky and then it's smooth? Your regular grid won't capture these spikes. So you want finite grid in here. Now in 2D, you can't do that easy. That's more complicated, and then you could use finite elements. That's all. Basically, if you want more, if your function is locally more spiky, has more information, and and it's not covered by your 1 kilometer grid, and there you might want a 100 meter grid, or in a town you might, I'm just saying something, a 1 meter grid, and those methods accommodate that. So they zoom in and they zoom out. That's all. It's
Imagine
no more complicated.
the scale of the representation with the spatial granularity of the process.
As long as you need that. If you don't need it, if you're happy with an average, we don't care. Then use your grid. But the question is, with which processes do you need it, and for which process?
Okay, can I just explain how Endler works?
Yeah, but this is just more generic.
But Endler's been mentioned, so we should talk a little bit about that.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right.
My point was just that I know one of the PhD students has looked into it. I don't know if it's still looking into it because I think it is quite complicated.
That's good.
But yeah, I just
That's
thought
the purpose of this thing, isn't it? I mean,
I just
this
thought
sounds really
I'd mention it,
fascinating. It's not something that
and you can
I know.
you can
And let's
kind
say
of
you've
deal
got
with misalignment.
You've got lots of data,
Oh,
data,
right.
spatial data. And you measure things here. So you measure the number of beavers here. Okay? But what we want is to be able to predict the number of beavers anywhere. Okay? So traditional way to do that would be sometimes called kriging, where you fit a guessing test. So what Indler does, it recasts kriging as the solution to a stochastic partial differential equation. Okay? So kriging fits a Gaussian process. Now the Gaussian process is the solution to this stochastic partial differential equation. And the way it does it, if I get another colour, it solves that stochastic partial differential equation, which you don't have to worry about. This is all done in the software. Because everyone runs when they see SPDE. Oh no, the rest of us run when they see stochastic partial differential equation, because it's really complicated. But what it does is it solves this and it puts in a grid, and they are triangles in Inlet. And here, there's not much information, so you have a big triangle.
Yeah.
Here we've got not much small triangles. And it solves that SPE on that triangle. Now the advantage of doing that is, one, it's really efficient, because the guys who do it have really good code, but normally when you do kriging, your length scale is constant. So the correlation at a certain distance here is the same as a certain distance here. Within that, that's not true. It allows it to vary that correlation length scale as you go across the field.
So, and within each triangle.
No, it'll put more triangles in.
No, so once it's finished this, it can estimate within each triangle.
Yes, once it's finished this, you can put it back on your 1 kilometre grid if you want to 1 kilometre grid. There are routines to get from the triangles back to the grid. You're not stuck on the triangles.
Yeah. But I'm trying to understand what the output from the
The
process
output
is.
would be the number of beavers at each place. The density of beavers, if that's the data.
Assuming you observe the population.
You've observed at the white points.
Yeah, but quite often we haven't observed the
Well,
population.
if you haven't got data, you This is a method of interpolating data.
Yeah,
It's a method of interpolating data. If you don't need data, you're stuck.
No, you don't even that. If you know it's more grainy and you have your model for the graininess, you also locally you can also still use it, but then it's a model and not data. I mean, if you know that you need more fine scale information, if you want that or need that, then you put in a finer mesh.
There's a granularity in these sort of models, I presume, that's actually not to do with solving a set of equations that whether the horizontal flux are key, but it's actually to do with the scale of decision making, isn't it? Really?
Within our models.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that what it's about?
That's that 1 kilometre grid really is what
I
we're
mean,
saying.
really
We'll do
should be-
something in that place.
Yeah. What
But
would
that's not
happen?
to say the processes that underpin what happens when we do something in that place can work on different scales. I mean, we're going to do something with this 1 kilometre square.
But that's why I could imagine that on a city scale, you might actually need 100 meters or 10 meters,
You
right?
might
For the decision making.
No, but I imagine you might want a bigger grid there, where you've got units that are related to the decision making.
Yeah, but then
Depends on what you want.
But
Yeah.
I imagine that for different values, for example, for the recreational value, you have more data points and more fine scale because might have in a urban setting, you might have green spaces. Whether for other type of landscapes, farming or whatever, or forestry, you really have less dots in there. And therefore you might need a better interpolation of the data.
The problem is
So I
that
think-
they've actually got the entire population in the land cover and land use there, because it's aggregated up from each individual land parcel.
Yeah.
So it's, you've got actually, you're just scaling up from
Yes,
that
I do,
already.
yeah.
So actually the real decision is the field.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that I think this allows you to interpolate that data, to bring it all to the one grid or whatever you want, but acknowledging that your data points are different for different ecosystem services in terms, because you have more granularity for some ecosystem services like recreation. You have other granularity for other ecosystem services.
We see applications in some statistics.
And then you elevate everything to the decision making scale that you want.
But you
That's what I mean. Yes, exactly.
But the approach you use now with the regular grade fits the keep it simple stupid because it's the best thing to do first.
There's lots of other things that is wrong with it as well. So but I think that's really interesting for us. Well, for me,
It's a refinement. It's not the basic thing.
And I can see some of the valuation. To be honest, shall I continue? The environmental models that we're using that data and we're using, I'm really nothing to do with. So, but I can see how then we're putting over this 1 kilometre grid, and everyone else is sort of to fit that decision-making grid.
And I think it also historically, in all of the kind of last 30 years, the way that like agriculture and has been modelled and advice has been provided to farmers in terms and to policy, they're very happy with a 1K grid. So there's also about how you talk to people. So if you think about all the work that ADAS have done, sort of developing interactive runoff models, soil pollution models. There are hundreds of them, and they're all basically there's a historical need for the 1K grid because actually DEFRA, that's what they understand. So there's a little bit of that as well.
It's true. I'm sort of trying to think of the processes. I can imagine some natural flood management things. You're going to get this quite fine scale thing if you're thinking about.
The obvious one's catchments, sub-catchments and catchments. That's the obvious one. That's the opposite net.
Well, that's what we're using at a very coarse scale because we're just aggregating everything in there. All right, so I was going to talk a little bit about this optimization. We've got these decisions about where to put a number of things. We've got to site power plants. So there's different sorts of power plants in here. We've got some fairly small, what we call bioenergy power plants. They're local sort of 40 megawatt things. There's one near here in Ely. There's a few around the country. So they're going to take biocrops from local production, miscanthus or short rotation coppice, and burn those. So you grow the stuff that's source carbon, then you burn it. So they're supposed to be roughly carbon neutral. But in fact, GGR, we're looking at some of those assumptions. We've got these big bioenergy carbon capture and storage things. Now these are enormous. This is like Drax up on the northeast coast there. So these are 500 megawatt size power plants. We're going to need quite a few of those if we're going to get anywhere near this net zero carbon target. So many so that it's going to be impossible to source them from domestic. So quite a lot of what's going on is we're going to have to import residues, forest residues or other residues from overseas. At the moment we bring most of the stuff in from America. Anna, you can probably correct me if I'm getting this wrong. Yeah, so it gets shipped in.
Southern USA into Yorkshire.
So we're going to think about some assumptions about how much we're going to want to source locally, how much we're going to be wanting to bring in from overseas, but there's only certain places you can put those. So we've got a fixed set of sites we can choose from because they've got to be near to the right infrastructure to get the gas captured and then stuck in pipes and either shipped or taken straight out to the North Sea. The solar farms, the onshore wind, those can go pretty much everywhere. In the model I'm going to show you, we're only thinking about putting them on current agricultural land. So we could put them on grassland, we could cut woods down. That's all possible in the model. At the moment we're just looking on current agricultural land. And the thing which is driving their productivity obviously is solar radiation and wind speed. There's other things that are going on in there. So when you put wind farms in places, you have to cut down trees around, you have to put roads up to there, there's effects on the soil carbon, so that's all come out of work from Aberdeen. So we've got a series of impacts that come from these, and we're trying to use those, including recreation, the carbon, the effect on, I've got them somewhere, the effect on visual disamenity, a set of these ecosystem service values, and we're trying to think, where should we put the power plants, where should we put the solar farms, where should we put the biocrops, and we could put them there, or we could put them some other place, and we've got a whole series of optimization algorithms that we've taken mostly, we're just picking these up from the facility location literature, from the OR literature. So this is sort of literature from back in, I guess it starts in the 60s, where they started using these optimization models to think, well, where should we put the next McDonald's, given there's a Burger King there and we want to be close to our supply chain. So we're taking those and trying to use these here. I'm really interested, if people are, of other ways we can solve these complex problems, because they seem to me complex anyhow. They're these big spatial combinatorial problems. We could do multiple things in the same location. Yeah, go on. If you've got a solution, you can just go straight away. I'll tell you what I've done, and then we'll see.
Is it a linear or non-linear problem, or you already seem to
Well,
say
it all depends. There's all sorts of different little problems
because
going on
usually
here.
cost might be non-linear, right? So then this optimization problem is quite different, but it seems that it's linear by giving that you click.
Well, I was going to show you something tomorrow. You might bore me by then, but where the big problems for me start coming where you get spatial interaction across cells. So it depends. If I put one thing here, then that has an effect on the value surface, as I'd call it, in all other locations around it. Then you have these combinatorial problems. So I'll just go through these on so you can, if you've got suggestions. So we're thinking about, we hypothesised we could have on a 10 kilometre network places we could put these small bioenergy plants. So we could do that more fine-grained, but it's taking a bit of time to do it. Well, the first thing we've got to do therefore is, across that whole potential places we put there, is work out how much it costs us, both in terms of the cost of creating the transmission, the wires that will go from that power plant to the transmission network, both in terms of the costs of doing that financially and the effects on putting up new pylons, on removing agricultural land to do that. So we have those costs, and we're going to use these optimal routing algorithms to work out. Dijkstra's algorithm is the one we use. We only need to run that once, so it takes a while to run for every location, but we can do that straight away. And that's a little bit more complicated, because we also got to make a decision about, well, if I get to a transmission station and it hasn't got enough capacity, it might be the cheapest one to get to, but then I've got to think about the costs of upgrade as well. So the social costs would be including that upgrade. So we've got to make a decision about whether to go to the closest one and upgrade it, or whether to route all its way to the closest one which actually has some capacity. It actually turns out to be cheaper, and these are the sort of problems we're coming up against. This is my sort of plea to mathematicians who might know how to solve these. It actually would turn out to be cheaper to upgrade all in one go. But the way things are working, we're working, we get to a power station, we upgrade it from that power station, place another power station, and then that comes and says, well, the best thing to do is upgrade it at this at the same time. So we're not doing that simultaneously. We're sort of doing it in a greedy sense, one at a time. So if there's any ways of solving those problems, that would be great. We could sort of do, so the next problems are to do with, well, for any particular power station location, which set of land cells do I use to grow the biocrops? So we've got this problem going on about deciding which ones to do. And it could be that we have two power stations next to each other, they're cheap to connect to the network, but they're then going to be competing over parcels of land to grow the biocrops on. So you have this sort of simultaneous problem. We can write that out as an integer linear program. We could solve it for reasonably small cases, maybe 50 by 50, but then we start struggling. If we're starting to do this on tens of thousands of cells, we've absolutely had it. So in the end, we do this greedy approach that I was talking about. We place one which is the most valuable, work out the upgrade,
Trouble
and
is,
go to the next one.
yeah, your best location might not be in your set of your best 4 locations.
Oh, you're gonna have to explain that a bit better to me.
So it depends on, you know, if your number 1 location, you want to, you know, you think about it as like a dice, okay? You know, you've got a dice, and if you've got 1 dot, you place it in the middle, okay? Now, if you then wanted 4 dots and you wanted to spread them out equally, let's assume an even distribution, you wouldn't have the dot in the middle.
Absolutely.
That's the issue. That's
absolutely
a
the issue.
classic kind of don't do sequential location allocation kind of stuff.
So we're looking at, there's got a PhD student who's looking at the difference between these 2 algorithms to show where it makes a difference.
Yeah.
And I agree. So we can write out the problem and do it on a small scale. But I can't deal with the big
I've
scale.
got another suggestion. You start talking about the small stuff.
Yeah.
I think this is like a packing problem. So surely you sort out the big stuff first. When I go to IKEA, right, I've bought too much stuff.
Yeah.
What I do is I try and pack in all the big things first, and then fit the little things in around them.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's a really simple logic. But that might, I wonder whether, I don't know whether the sequence of your presentation is also the sequence of your evaluation. As
It is pretty much.
I go the way around, I start with the big
When
stuff.
I say small problem here, they're actually quite big problems. You'll see how much land they take up. But I'm saying we're going to do it on this area of land, and then we can solve it.
But
Talking
if
to
you have the resource,
Richard Everson, he suggests there's ways of doing it locally and then solving it properly locally and then somehow overlapping the local solutions, but it's beyond my understanding of these optimisations.
I have written an algorithm that sorts out non-overlapping catchments for these.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, let's have a chat. Any advice you've got is great.
So your what things are you taking into account with these sightings? So is it, well, you're supposed to going to tell me that there's 2 big ways. You want to compare 2 major ways, one where it's only about the most efficient energy production and one about where you try to minimise the cost of everything else.
There's lots of things you can do, yeah.
Just wondering. And maybe you should go to.
Should I just keep going? Come
So
back to
there was yours and yeah, keep going. But I'm interested in whether those energy scenarios that you showed earlier on, do they give you the total number of small plants and large plants?
Yeah, I probably haven't been very clear
everything
on
like
that.
that. So that's a given.
Yeah, so we
Just
start
have to
from the
find
idea
ways
that we've got to achieve what's given by one of those UK TM pathways. We've got to have this many bioenergy plants, we've got to have this much solar. So we're going from the assumption that we can just choose. Remember the diagram I gave earlier? We're down the right hand side here, assuming that we're just going to be able to choose the optimal set of locations in which to achieve what this pathway wants. These are targets over every 5 years. We're doing this first 5 years, targets next 5 years, next 5 years, next 5 years. So that's given. We're not saying anything about whether it's a good or bad decision to achieve that, just saying something about how, if you start thinking about environmental concerns, does that make a difference to the way in which we decide to spread this out across the
It makes
country?
the problem easier purely from an optimisation point of view.
Yeah.
But there's also another
but
issue.
What flexibility do you have? Do you have flexibility to have more small plants and fewer large plants?
You could do. We
Yeah.
don't. We make an assumption that they're all small, but you could.
But the other issue, and one of the reasons for doing this, is that one of the other interests is basically how viable are these kinds of UK TM model frameworks in a world with a lot more spatially dependent renewables. In other words, actually the model says yes, you can do this, but actually physically, can you do it? This is why we took those targets and then said, well, actually, can we implement them? And if you do, what's the kinds of costs involved?
Brett, can I just ask about the constraints, or the optimization doesn't have any constraints?
Not really, no. So depends which optimization you're talking about.
That you can do, but then you can do it everywhere.
Yeah, but it's perfectly possible to put, one of Brett's PhD students, one of the parts of her research is going to be looking at, well, okay, if you said, right, let's not put any of these things in a national park or an AONB, what's the trade-off of doing that? What's the cost of doing that, making that decision? Yeah. You can build that into that kind of framework.
Yeah, but you can also just have the constraints in there, and then therefore will not give you anything in a natural park.
Yeah, Yes. So it's interesting to see what the difference is. If you say you're going to go in the national park, you're effectively saying that has infinite value in its current land use. And then if we would make the energy system that we're trying to achieve more expensive, because often those national parks are high up, you'll see some maps in a second, that's where we got a lot of wind. So we get some idea of what we're sacrificing in terms of the increased cost of the energy system by deciding to keep those free of wind farms.
Yeah, but that's introducing the constraints through the objective function. I just thinking that sometimes you have other constraints that are difficult through the values in the system. For example, in some places you might not have enough agricultural land to produce, connected enough to produce biofuels or whatever. I just thinking more.
So there's two or three constraints we're going to look at. One I've been sort of chatting with Jenny over the last couple of weeks, thinking about bringing in some sort of control that says we don't want to lose biodiversity. So we've got a set of models that are not with us yet.
Yeah.
We don't want to lose biodiversity.
A
second set might be we want to do this subject to the constraint that we don't reduce our food security using this measure of percentage of production that's home. I'm worried because I think we're going to write to Danny's stuff now. So, all right, I'll just try to show you some results. So that'll be good. So there's other optimization things we're using. Some are relatively easy because they're assignment problems. There's fairly simple ways of doing that. Some become very difficult when we're getting clashes across different technologies. We want to know, we might have got biocrops in there because we did that first, just as you said. So just Lex was saying, we put biocrops in first, then we put wind and solar, and we do those separately. We say, well, actually, those would quite like to go in the same place. So what do? Then we use an algorithm which basically reallocates to the place where we have the least opportunity cost. So if I can replace that and that, I choose the one which has got the second most easy to replace. It's less costly to replace. And we just go through doing that. We're not doing it simultaneously. There might be more interesting ways of doing that. So I don't know. I put optimization up as one thing that I'd like to see something maybe in this program looking at, because I think there's a lot of problems in this land use area where we've got to solve quite complicated combinatorial problems. And we do them time step by time step. So they're spatial temporal problems as well, because it matters what I do. So the real problem for you right now is much more complicated. We simplify it in ways which make it feasible for us to do. So go on then, here's some actual output. As Andrew says, this is fairly hot off the press. So what we're looking at here is the locations we choose for the low carbon pathway. It's got a fair amount of solar in, it's got a fair amount of wind in, a fair amount of bioenergy, and some of this, sorry, these aren't actually correctly labelled. So these light green ones are our bioenergy small plants, the dark green ones are our bioenergy stocks going to our big carbon capture storage. And we're assuming in this scenario that we're only trying to do 20% of the production at home. If the sorts of levels of carbon capture storage we would need, if we went to 100% domestic production, this map would be pretty much covered in biocrops. So some really interesting things. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but so are you looking at the trade-off from the existing land use from a financial value perspective?
Yes.
So you're displacing agricultural production.
Yes. Yeah. So we have an agricultural model in there which is estimates the cost of agriculture, which is why we can start thinking about, like we talked the other day about putting in policies.
I mean, probably it's not for this forum. This is very, very close to what I did for my PhD. Although it was not looking at an optimization problem. It was looking at an agent-based model, sort of simulating policy environment and trying to play out decisions rather than trying to optimize. And it had some other, didn't have some stuff that you've got like the transmission network. So, but a lot of the other things are quite
what you're doing, I think that's great, because it's that last part that I think is really relevant. We could, if we got this all right, say exactly what we want the landscape to look like in the future. How do you deliver it?
Right, and you said 20 slides ago there was two pathways on that diagram. You had the sort of the optimal one, and you have the realistic simulation of policy and behavioural aspect. And that's a common distinction, if you like.
That's right. Something Danny's going to talk on the chalkboard in a minute. My eyes together. That's coffee first.
Sorry. Yeah, okay.
Right, what we're doing here, these are two different optimizations. So we're making the same measure, which is this idea of social welfare, which is adding up the costs, and the vast majority of these costs are in the construction costs of the power plants and the and the transmission stuff. So they're fairly big totals, and 23 billion in net present value total. So these are costs. This is the cost of the system. We're putting this system in. It's going to cost us a whole bunch of money to do that. And on the left-hand side, we're only concerned about those things which go through markets. So we're only concerned about the cost in terms of agricultural production, the cost in terms of building the plants, of getting the transmission network going. So these turn out to be the welfare costs. I've put these all in money terms now. So we've optimised just for a part of it, and this is the outcome. And you'll see there's different costs associated with different parts of the energy system, living as this total here. If we optimise for welfare, so now we're taking account of all those non-market things that are in the model, it's not complete, it's partial, we see that we make some changes. They're not massively significant, but the quantities are actually start to be quite big. So we're talking about 229 million in net present value terms. So the cost of the system in this welfare term is reduced when we start taking into account the system services we've got.
Right.
Yeah.
In a general sense, can you explain why the differences are actually so small? That it doesn't have to look so similar to me.
I'll put something else up. But I was very sceptical about putting out the sum of it. Okay, so we've brought in, let's call it a simplified high flow model, which we've associated with flood damages. Now this is a bit, because it's based on hydrological models which aren't currently in Scotland. We do find that when we start planting up large areas, hydrological models suggest reductions in peak events, so peak flow events, which we then associate with flood damages. And so when we bring that in, this makes a bit of a difference. One of the reasons this isn't making a massive difference is you're roughly planting the same amount of trees and stuff, so the carbon effect of all these things is relatively similar. We're just choosing to avoid certain things. It turns out you're tending to go, the agricultural land is in both. So you're not going to take really high value agricultural land out under the financial, and you don't do it under here as well. So there's some other benefits that come. It turns out that it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of recreation. People don't particularly mind going through fields of miscanthus as opposed to fields of wheat. There's a small negative there, but it's not substantial. So when we start bringing these things in, we have information on the biodiversity, I just haven't brought that in. And it turns out that planting up large areas of land with miscanthus or with short rotation coppice, it's not particularly bad for biodiversity. And it has a good effect on nutrients because usually you're displacing agricultural production, which is higher in nutrients. So it's, the changes aren't huge, and I think that's one of the things we see, and it depends because we've got these last couple of things to bring in. There is this fact that as we go to larger and larger scale bioenergy, that we're going to be doing the thing that Bill was very concerned about, which is just having a monocrop of these plants. And it'll be interesting to see whether the measures of diversity of species that remain as a result of that, if we constrain to not do that, what effect that has on the model. So it does have some effects, and it has more, that was a mistake. It has more significant effects when you start trying to place these things in order to have some effect on flood damages or to encourage beavers to build dams. And here what you're seeing is you're deciding to place up around, not surprisingly, around the headwaters of so this is all putting effectively woodland around the headwaters of the Thames. This is doing it around Birmingham. This is doing it across the peaks to avoid the flows down into Leeds and Bradford. You don't believe this, do you?
You shouldn't upset your colleagues with the beaver remark. They're not my colleagues, they're yours.
Why mine? Economists. Anyhow, and so what another thing you can do, and this is sort of moving towards thinking about, well, what are the consequences? What are the costs of the economy of doing this as we move from an energy island, where we're basically going back to coal and nuclear, through to something which we just looked at, where we're trying to go low carbon, something where we're attempting to almost get to the net zero. And there's another one over here where you will achieve net zero, so the increasing cost of the system. And you can see this scales up considerably. So there's a point, and this is what we're doing in Fauci's Yard, there's a point at which we can get the low-hanging fruit. You can do things which basically have pretty limited impacts on the costs of these systems, but then as you go higher and higher, needs for...
and what period are those costs over, Brett?
Sorry?
What period are those costs over?
These are all out to 2050.
The optimism was till 2080. Yeah, I heard that, right? No. Oh, well.
No, it's all to 2050. It's just that technical optimism pathway doesn't reach a net zero solution until around the 2080s.
I see.
Anyway.
But the technology optimism is more low carbon than the low carbon, is that right?
Yes, basically yes.
They chose the names.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, should we go on from there quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So, very, very fast. One of the other issues we've got is that the percentage of domestic feedstock has a really big influence on these results. So we need a way of looking at the impact outside the UK. So what we've got as another part of the project, which I won't go into in enormous detail, basically we can link UKTM with a multi-regional input-output model, the GTAP trade basis, and we have people in Southampton and Leeds, some of your colleagues, and basically you can generate indicators of different impacts in different countries around the world. And there's work that Rob Holland and Kate Scott in particular have done to do this, and so we can start to generate for a whole series of different sorts of indicators impacts of these different pathways on different countries of the world. So that's another dimension of it. So we can look at the kind of domestic versus global trade-off. What we're doing, we've basically got things to add, as Brett has said. We've got some additional resource under the next phase of UKIRK to take some of these things a bit further, for instance, to potentially include air pollution. We're trying to investigate at the moment whether we can use this sort of thing to run a net zero pathway. And then what we've also got, we were asked to do a bid for the Landscape Decisions Programme, which we did earlier this year. We've been awarded 2 years funding, literally starting this month, for this project that's now called Advances, which is all about trying to take what we've done, broaden it out, and particularly look at some of these sorts of issues to do with uncertainties. This is the kind of objectives. So we don't really have at the moment a particularly strong way of looking at decision making under uncertainty. So one of the things that we're very keen to do as part of this next project is to look at ways of trying to build that in, to try and build in, for instance, ideas from portfolio theory and so forth, and look at how we might be able to do that. We want to look at some of the issues to do with sort of spatial dependence, networking effects, and so on and so forth. We're looking at ways of trying to build in better valuations of some of the sort of the hard to value ecosystem services, so specifically things to do with biodiversity and cultural ecosystem services. And we want to try and sort of engage with users. So we've got people like DEFRA and the Woodland Trust involved in this project as sort of partner users. But we're also really interested in trying to build capacity across the maths and statistics community. So we're very keen on trying to identify people who would like to be involved in this project, could come to workshops, could potentially contribute ideas that we could implement as part of this work program.